Hey everybody, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who doesn't release podcast episodes for weeks on end, Blunchley. In today's episode, 3 political hot takes that nobody asked for from yours truly. Let's do our usual bit of waffling before jumping into the episode proper. This episode technically is not the first episode I'm releasing in 2026. That dubious distinction goes to the accidental part 2 of Localism and Organized Labor. But this episode 24, is the first one I'm actually writing for 2026. And with the new year, I'm trying to rethink my approach to the podcast and to the product that I'm delivering to your ears. Episode length started getting very, very long as 2025 continued, as the 2 90-minute episodes on Organized Labor showed. And speaking personally, I love these super indulgent, crazy long, crazy broad episodes where I can just rant and rant about all these interests of mine and all these niche topics that are relevant to the localist movement. But while those are fun for me to write and record, they aren't much fun to actually listen to. And the point of doing this podcast is to try and get people interested in the project of localism, not to turn their brains off by outstaying my welcome with hour-long episodes. Not to take y'all behind the curtain, but in addition to our podcast episodes, we do YouTube shorts that are about 3 minutes long. We try and often fail to have a different piece of content released every week, definitely failed lately. A long episode one week, a related YouTube short the next, and so on and so forth. The shorts consistently get way, way better numbers than our full podcast episodes. And I think that's because they're efficient and digestible and more algo-friendly than just an hour-long video with the localism logo slapped on it. Now, I do think there's a lot of value in having a space and a content type where I can engage with ideas a little more deeply, give them a bit of space to breathe, and be considered in ways that aren't quite so TikTok-brained. So I'm not going to be getting rid of the podcast episodes or limiting them to 10 minutes or anything like that. But I am going to be making an effort to make the podcast shorter, tighter, more listenable, and less scattered. I'll also be trying to make the topics a bit more, topical and leap off the title or YouTube preview page a little bit more. Call it Localism's 2026 New Year's resolution. Thus, today's topic, which I fear does verge on clickbait, but hopefully you'll let it slide just this once. I've picked some pretty fun hot takes, at least I think so, and I'm hopeful they'll spur some thoughts and discussion. There's no citations, no real empirical evidence, none of that annoying and inconvenient stuff like proof or a basis in reality. Nope, the only thing you'll find in this episode is vibes and tea leaves and my political instincts tingling like the little politics freak I am. Lastly, a huge apology for going dark for more than a month. I've had some stuff in my personal life that's kept me busy, all good and exciting and positive and beneficial stuff, but also the kind of stuff that makes it hard to find time to write and record for the show. I'm 99% sure the gap between this episode and the next one will be much, much shorter. Thanks so much for your patience and for your support. Now, let's roll the intro and get into it. Okay, time for the Localism Podcast 3 political hot takes for 2026 and beyond. A brief flashing disclaimer here at the top. I am not saying that I want any of this stuff I'm about to talk about to happen, or that it would be good if it did, except for one of the takes, and I'll be sure to flag that one. I am not saying I'm hoping any of these hot takes come true. I'm not saying I don't hope they come true. All I am saying is that I think they might happen, for better or for worse. No bigger judgment, no sneaky agenda, except, again, for one of the takes, and I'll flag that one. So you gotta promise not to get mad because I say something that might happen that you don't support politically. Deal? Deal. Alright, covering my ass over, it's hot take time. Drum roll, please. Everyone be quiet. A middle-aged white man with political opinions is about to speak. Hold your applause until the end. Hot take number 1. In the next 10 years, a political force will enter the American stage that represents a synthesis of certain specific parts of current left-wing and MAGA ideology. Okay, I can practically hear the boos emanating through the internet and into my headphones. No, this is not some horseshoe theory BS. No, this is not some weird centrist, actually all these guys are the heckin' same and why can't we all just get along and grill for God's sake kind of thing. What I'm saying here is that I think there are threads of shared ideology between the current MAGA movement and people that lean pretty left-wing, and that under the right set of political circumstances, people from those particular chunks of the American political landscape could coalesce into a shared group or movement. Not necessarily an actual political party. I don't have much faith we'll be getting out from under the thumb of the two-party system anytime soon, sorry, but certainly a discernible interest, a political undercurrent with at least some strength. So what do I mean when I say that left-wing and MAGA types could coalesce around a shared set of positions? Well, it doesn't actually have anything to do with some crossover between right-wing and left-wing ideals. Instead, it has to do with a crossover between the Trump conservative movement and left-wing ideals. And that crossover is possible because Trump's brand of republicanism, of nominal conservatism, of Make America Great Again, has this fascinating streak of economic populism. And economic populism completely at odds with what we've sort of gotten used to as traditional conservatism. Now, Trump himself, like the man personally, is not an economic populist. He is, with all due respect to any conservative listeners who I haven't managed to scare away by this point, an economic meist, by which I mean just a dude who sees federal politics as a way to make himself and his family and his economic interests richer. Thus, all the bullshit ties to the Middle East and taking jets from Qatar and hiding Venezuelan oil money in Qatari banks and cutting taxes on the rich and trying to enter defense pacts with fucking Saudi Arabia. Are you fucking kidding me? Disgusting. But I digress. While Trump himself doesn't actually give much of a shit about economically helping out the little guy, his supporters, the MAGA movement as a whole, definitely do, or at least signal they do. And so Trump has to put this veneer, and sometimes more of a veneer, of economic populism onto his politics. Thus, we start a tariff trade war, ostensibly to protect national manufacturing and American jobs, a complete spit in the face to traditional conservative free market principles. Aside from Democrats running a literal dementia patient as a candidate and then somehow just choosing a candidate that nobody actually wanted to vote for via a Democratic primary, the big thing that wins Trump the election is the cost of everyday items like eggs and the devastating effects inflation has had on individuals. Affordability becomes the watchword of the day, and so Trump always has to do something of a dog and pony show to show how everyday life has gotten cheaper since he took office. Trump is always scheming something that seems little guy wallet focused. He's spinning the idea of 50-year mortgages, which is substantively probably insane, but from a purposive perspective is meant to address the base's complaints about how fucked up the housing market has gotten. He leans on JPOW to cut rates, which is really just because he wants it to be cheaper for himself and his businesses to borrow money, but justifies it on the grounds that it will help relieve Americans' swelling credit card and other forms of debt. He talks about bringing down the price of prescription medicines. He tries to ban private equity from buying up single-family homes. He leans on defense contractors to stop paying their executives so much and stop doing stock buybacks. Trump cuddles up to unions and tries to get the Teamsters to endorse him. If you told me 15 years ago that a Republican would be pushing this stuff and not a Democrat, I would have laughed in your face. And the interesting thing about Trump is that his rhetoric isn't just, oh, it would be nice if we had this stuff, or yes, the problem with prescription meds is serious, and that's why we need to get the federal government out of that field, or whatever. He doesn't just say that stuff is good in the abstract, but that the Fed should have no role in it, which would hew at least a little more closely to how conservatives might have approached this issue in the past. No, Trump is willing to bring the full cannons of his executive apparatus and the federal government to bear to back up these efforts. He's ready to send in the Marines, so to speak. Because Trump is in many respects a pro-market intervention, pro-big government guy when it comes to this specific slice of economic issues. And that's because right now he is the government. So pro-big government is basically just pro-give me more power, which Trump is always going to be in favor of, and for that matter, most presidents are. As strange as it may seem, nothing proves Trump's desire to come off like a populist, at least an economic populist, than his trademark immigration policies. Now let's be so fucking for real. The real reason that Trump has handed DHS and ICE a blank check to do pretty much whatever the fuck they want is because there's a cadre of powerful people who just think if America was whiter, we'd all be better off. Sometimes he and his stupid little team of yes men and yes women even say this quiet part out loud, like with all that stupid protect the home front recruitment shit DHS was doing. And yes, there's some of his base that think that too. But some people don't think that, or at least don't think that explicitly, and that's why oftentimes Trump and his admin actually position his immigration push as an extension of economic policy. You'll see that J.D. Vance on Twitter is sometimes trying to tie the unaffordability of housing to increased demand from illegal immigrants. Trump or someone in his orbit will point to the presence of illegal immigrants as a reason for wages being low. The fig leaf on top of the admin's true motivations is usually something to the tune of, if we just deport enough people, then the economy will fix itself, your food and housing will get cheaper, and you'll get paid more for your work. Make no mistake, that is the thesis of an economic populist. And I think some people in the base genuinely think this. Note that the objective, better jobs in an economy that's better for the little guy, has some overlap with left-wing positions. The difference comes in tactics, not necessarily goals. Another Trump-aligned MAGA conservative position that can be expressed in terms of economic populism is actually isolationism. Now, given, let's just say, recent events, and the fact that, as far as I can tell, Trump's base isn't actually all that fussed about the Dawn Road Doctrine or the monthly drumbeat to bomb Iran, and then the actually bombing of Iran, maybe I'm overestimating the MAGA base's genuine commitment to non-interventionism or isolationism or whatever. But in addition to the idea that we probably shouldn't be doing military interventionism because it mostly just relies on us killing a bunch of innocent civilians to fill some oil execs' pockets, there's a real economic argument to be made, a non-moral, purely economic argument, that interventionism is extremely inefficient. It costs a shit ton of money to drone strike weddings and maintain military bases in the Middle East and send carrier groups trotting around the globe. Like, a truly huge shit ton of money. And when these imperial ambitions abroad actually need someone to go on the ground and fight, it's young American boys and girls who are the ones expected to go out and bleed to death on foreign soil. Paying for oil or rare earth metals or water or whatever with the lives of our children isn't just horrendous, it's also a waste of resources that could be put into much more productive and long-lasting domestic-focused roles. A lot of Trump supporters, at least in theory, and Trump himself, at least in theory doing a shit ton of work here, depart from the past Warhawk McCain types by decrying forever wars and America acting as the world police. They say they're sick of the world using American security spending to subsidize their own domestic safety, and that Europe and Asia need to start pulling their weight, but never in the Middle East. Funny how Trump seems to always forget about Qatar and Israel and Saudi Arabia relying on Americans for their security. Just look at the line that the admin has taken towards Ukraine. The conservative take for a long time was that Ukraine is a money pit, that America should stop throwing money into, and that Ukraine says something about America's security approach more broadly. As little as 15 years ago, it would be crazy to hear conservatives talking about how we need to reduce our defense spend and focus more on domestic matters, but that's kind of the party line now, or at least it was before Iran. Interesting times we live in. In summary, part of the MAGA spirit is using the federal government as a bludgeon to achieve populist outcomes like cheaper food, cheaper gas, and a better housing market, more affordable healthcare, more American jobs, less entanglement with global capital. Simultaneously, a part of the MAGA DNA is that our foreign military adventures were huge, expensive mistakes that redirected resources that should have gone to making Americans' lives better domestically. And a particular note is that these positions are quite popular with the much-vaunted Zoomers of the new conservative movement, the younger crowd that's giving MAGA juice with memes and vitality and, the talking heads hope, durability. These guys are too young to have all the ideological hang-ups that a conservative who voted for Bush or Reagan might. They're used to having the federal government's strength be used as a solution for problems, including economic problems like affordability and healthcare and industry. They lived through the housing crisis. They saw the bailouts. They've lived in a time when the national conversation is about what is the federal government going to do next to solve our problems. If someone else comes along who channels the same fuck you energy as Trump and says that he's going to use the machinery of the federal government to make rent cheaper and food cheaper and healthcare cheaper and wages higher and spending on military lower, these kids are going to listen in a way that the previous generation of conservatives wouldn't have. They've been primed to. They came of political age in an era where this approach to social problems was normalized. And then you have the left, who of course has been all about federal government intervention in the private market from the start, or at least calling certain strains of left-wing thought broadly left. Stop blowing up kids abroad. Stop spending money on oil wars and lower my damn rent, please. Tax the rich elite, make housing more affordable, lower our military footprint in other countries, increase spending on domestic stuff like education, and stop moving manufacturing overseas to cheap out on paying American labor. These have been consistent left-wing talking points for at least a decade, even if the powers that be have just as shallow a commitment to them as Trump does. The tone and tenor and posture of the way these desires are discussed and the policy to implement them is presented is definitely not exactly the same as the MAGA movement. Your mainstream Democrat is probably never going to say we need to deport people to make housing more affordable, for instance. But there is undeniably an overlap here. There is a zone of shared interest. Perhaps a zone of shared agreement? Okay, you know the old saying that economists have successfully predicted like 300 of the past 2 recessions? Well, the idea that actually working class people from across party lines are going to coalesce around a shared economic platform has been kicked around a bajillion times by various forces on either side of the political spectrum, and guess what? That shit has not manifested. While a MAGA conservative and a liberal may have a surprising amount of overlap on some of these economic issues, there is still a shit ton that divides them and would prevent them from ever forming any kind of, broad-based coalition. They just have different visions about what American society should look like socially and culturally. They probably live in different types of communities with different problems and needs that drive their worldviews. They have severely different opinions on matters like abortion, vaccines, gun rights, women's rights, trans rights, gay rights, all the hot-button issues. They likely disagree on matters like the federal deficit and taxation and regulation and the Electoral College. Your average MAGA person and liberal person aren't going to suddenly join hands because they happen to agree on a few things about tax policy and foreign policy. Those few points of similarity won't be enough to overcome the ocean of other differences. But that's the average left-wing person, not all left-wing people. Similarly, that's the average MAGA person, not all MAGA people. There is one population where the line between left and right-wing is more blurred, where ideological loyalties are more complicated, a group where those from the right might want new leadership, and those on the left might want a home that feels more attentive to their needs. I'm talking, of course, about young men. Men between the age of, let's say, 18 to 35. Not all young men. Like any other demographic group, young men are not a monolith, and there is a big difference between a 24-year-old dude in the trades who lives with his wife and 2 kids in Alabama and the single 24-year-old gay guy who is a PhD candidate at NYU. No, I'm talking about a very specific slice of young men. That slice is young men that possess specific characteristics. They are highly online. They are by and large kind of checked out of politics. Maybe they voted for Obama back in the early teens if they're old enough. Maybe they voted for Trump because they thought he was funny. Maybe they threw a primary vote at Bernie back in the day. Maybe they voted for Trump again just because they saw him as a rejection of a system that had produced a dementia patient for president. More likely, they haven't voted in any election, presidential or otherwise, in the past 10 years. They don't really have what you might call ideological commitments. What do I mean by this? It's not that they aren't smart or don't have strong opinions, it's just that they don't really have very defined or consistent beliefs about political stuff. A lot of them probably like Trump just because he makes a lot of people mad and is charismatic and kind of a walking meme. They might appreciate how the MAGA movement is all about doing a bunch of politically incorrect and insensitive shit, which this slice of young men also enjoy doing in their social groups and online circles and hobby circles, and enjoy seeing done in their media and, yes, their podcasts. But they aren't dyed-in-the-wool supremacists or conservatives or really dyed-in-the-wool anything. They just think all of this stuff is funny and feel, rightly or wrongly, that everybody else is a killjoy or a shrill SJW for getting so worked up about it. They don't really have a strong investment in most of the left-wing cultural topics, partially because most of them don't really have anything to do with young men, that is, those cultural topics, and partly because they're too busy getting entertainment out of poking fun at the people who do care about them. They don't have a strong investment in the right-wing cultural topics for the same reason, and would probably laugh at, or at least kind of tune out, anybody who is just a little too sincere, huffing their own farts a little too much about respect for the flag, or young people not having manners, or religion fading in America. If you ask them to set out their political beliefs, you'd probably get kind of a medley of vague talking points rather than any real answers. If they watched a political debate and then you asked them who won, they would probably make their decision based on who created the best soundbite, or who did the most meme-worthy thing, or who got the most zingy, TikTokable, epic own moment. Watch SJW Hillary epically owned and trolled by Drumpf. But even if they could not sort of put it into words, these young men do have a feeling. The fact that they don't have incredibly substantial or fleshed-out political positions does not mean that they're unintelligent or that they don't have good political instincts. It just means that them paying attention to that kind of thing hasn't been rewarded. So what they have is not really a coalesced set of positions, but a feeling, a malaise that hangs over them and permeates all aspects of their life. Some are conscious of that permeation, some aren't. And this is the feeling of being left behind. The feeling that the world just doesn't really care about them and their needs and wants. The feeling that whatever you want to call it, the culture, the political discourse, the national conversation, that thing out in the air, whatever it is, it just simply isn't about them anymore. It's not just that you're not the center anymore, it's that you aren't even at the table, you aren't even a consideration. And while these young men, these kids really, may not be pondering politics, their malaise is driven by and coalesces around certain true facts of their lives that have permeated their outlooks. stagnant wages, rising economic inequality, the control of social and political life by political and economic forces that have been deliberately placed outside of their and our control, the lies of Afghanistan and Iraq and now Venezuela and Iran, the lies around Epstein, knowing that they will probably never own a home, debt, always debt, looming, whether that's student debt or car debt or credit card debt or medical debt, resentment towards a corporate culture that signals virtue by showing how much all these big companies care about people who aren't young men. In fact, they signal virtue specifically by indicating that they deprioritize men in favor of people with other characteristics. Meanwhile, the companies act terribly, encouraging conflation of their insincere commitment to goals with those same goals being terrible in and of themselves. Access to higher education is becoming narrower for these young men. Within the 2024 to 2025 time period, 58% of college enrollees were women, and this trend appears to be accelerating over time. Young men may not have fully cataloged all these factors, but they sense their effects. Given these headwinds, no wonder young men withdraw into themselves and into their subcultures. No wonder they're attracted to these spaces that are loud and crude and contrary to public norms of respectability. No wonder they cling to these social strategies of exclusion and offensivity in order to carve out a space for themselves that they think will push back against the social forces that define their lives. Weighed down by the reduced sense of agency and conditioned distaste for social norms, no wonder they don't turn out to vote. No wonder they aren't volunteering for the military anymore. They can sense that for their entire lives there hasn't been a just war, or even one that merely benefited someone other than oil executives and foreign interests. Iraq, Afghanistan, and now definitely Iran have proven that. Meanwhile, the incomes, educational outcomes, health, mental health, and happiness of young men worsen with each passing year. So here's kind of my pitch. Picture this. In the next couple of presidential elections, we have a candidate emerge on the periphery, posturing like he's going to run third party. He's youngish as presidential candidates go, which probably means he's like 45. And this guy's whole shtick is that he appeals specifically to young men as his supporting base. He brands himself as the candidate for young men TM. Maybe he's got a bit of a weird MGTOW or men's rights flavor, but he doesn't have to. He can just posture his platform as follows. He gets up on a podium, he looks into the camera and says, "Young men of this country, you have been ignored since the turn of the 21st century. That is going to change when I'm president." He lays out his planks. Young men need more economic opportunity, and it's being denied to them as they're shut out of higher education. So we focus on the trades and on unions and maybe even on some of the MAGA-aligned protectionist policy that the respectable members of both parties turn their noses up at. Young men are suffering from suicide at a disproportionate rate because they can't access the health care they need. And they can't afford to pay their medical insurance because the politicians couldn't figure out a system that works. So we make public health care a reality and ensure that our tax dollars are going to something that actually helps people every day. American culture has become hostile to young men and their needs and perspectives, especially in higher education. So we throw wokeness out the window, stop elevating some people over others just because they happen to be a different gender or color, and stop letting our dedication to virtue signaling get in the way of progress. We also stop letting that dedication to virtue signaling allow big corporate interests to get away with their bullshit. No more hiding behind rainbow flags and raised fists. It's time for elites and companies to pay their damn taxes. The blood of young men keeps getting spent fighting wars on foreign soil and for foreign interests. So we withdraw. Let the world take care of its own damn messes. Housing and jobs are hard to come by for young men, so we enforce immigration laws without quite reaching Trump's level of absurdity to ensure that American jobs are for American citizens. To an extent, the specific policies put forward aren't as important, as long as they result in unsubtle benefit for young men. What is important is the way that the candidate carries himself and communicates his message to his intended audience. He has to show young men that he cares about them, that he is listening to them, that he is taking their needs into account after utter failures from both parties to do so, and that he will act on what he is saying, that he is doing more than just throwing messages out into the ether to try and make a political play. He has to treat political correctness and DEI, if not with outright derision, then at least as inauthentic and out of touch with what most people actually want or need within the young male population. He has to castigate Republicans for treating young men like a priority and then sending them to die in foreign countries, denying them basic healthcare or housing, and creating an economy that crushes them in favor of a few privileged, superficially socially conscious elites that spout all this political correctness shit without actually embodying it. He has to castigate Democrats for not even pretending to give a shit about young men, for elevating the voices and needs of other populations while treating young men as secondary or even as outright enemies, people who should be blamed for not saying or thinking the right things or for voting for Trump. He has to earnestly look at the camera and say, look, if you young men go out and vote for me, I will be your president in a way that no party has for all of your life. I will be your guy. And neither of the candidates from the other party are going to do anything like that for you. And then he has to hope that this sincere or apparently sincere commitment to serving this population that rightly or wrongly feels ignored will spur them to action. He has to hope that this gets dudes who are kind of checked out or disillusioned to go out and support him. Will this guy ever win a presidential election or even a seat in Congress? No, probably not. At least I think so. Not in the 2020s, probably not even in the 2030s. But could this guy tap into a well of disillusioned young men in this country and get enough of them on board to command a 5% level of support in, say, the polls for presidential election? I certainly think so. 5% isn't a huge number, and there are a lot of disillusioned politically agnostic men out there. But you know what? There is one context in which 5% of everybody in America supporting you is a big deal. And that is modern presidential elections. In the modern era, we don't really see that many total landslides anymore. This gives power to niche populations that don't represent the nation as a whole, but represent some politically important portion of it. This is why Democrats have occasionally postured almost all their policy in the hopes of picking up like a couple thousand Cuban-American votes in Florida. Okay, that's an exaggeration. Even Dems are smart enough to the fact that Florida isn't really up for grabs during normal times. But the point still stands that people representing niche or minority populations can wield outsized power by playing kingmaker in a tightly contested presidential race. Just look at our friend of the pod and brainworm enjoyer, RFK Jr. This guy was not a serious candidate. He had no personal charisma, no substantial platform, no real chance at actually becoming president. But because his particular anti-establishment, anti-vaccine, and health views resonated with a slice of the population that Trump wanted to court, this walking joke literally changed the course of national politics and maybe American history. Note that I'm not saying we're going to have a magical third party arise out of nothing and assert itself. I'm not that dumb. The two-party system, like I already said, ain't going nowhere. But I am saying that you could form a coalition within that two-party context and that this coalition could coalesce into something that represents a political force to be reckoned with. So could we see this? Could we see a charismatic young candidate appeal to disillusioned young men, posture himself as both post-Democrat and post-MAGA, and then leverage that support into occupying a genuinely important role in maybe a future president's administration? Could we see a MAGA left-wing post-Trump hybrid emerge with a small but established place in national politics united around anti-war positions, populist economics, an anti-establishment bent, and a distaste for social or political correctness? I definitely think so, and the emergence of such a presence is my hot take number 1, which moves us on to, drumroll please, hot take number 2. Here it is. Sometime in the next 15 years, one or more states will perform the act of state separation, by which I mean the state will have a piece of its current territory split off, turning one state into two, the now smaller original state and the new breakaway. And actually, I guess I should have called this episode 3.5 Hot Takes, because this one comes with another half. This state separation will be facilitated by having either Puerto Rico or DC enter the Union at the same time as the other new state, meaning that within the next 2 decades, I'm calling that America will have 52 or more states. So before I can explain why I think this, I need to briefly talk about the political and legal mechanisms surrounding state separation and the admission of new states into the Union. We actually did an entire episode on state separation, episode 13, so if you want a more in-depth explanation, go give that episode a listen. But in short, basically state separations must follow a certain legal process, and as we'll see, that required political process shapes certain very specific political conditions that must be present in order for a state separation to go through. Here's the fast and dirty summary of the process by which a state can split into 2 new states. There are some specific things in the Constitution that say the federal government can't just make a new state out of a current state's territory without that current state's permission. Makes sense, right? Imagine if the feds just showed up and said, guess what, we're cutting Texas in half to make a new state, and there's nothing you can do about it. That would not end well. So instead, it's basically a 2-step process. First, the state legislature in the current state has to vote and say, sure, we're down to have this part of our territory break away. The state constitution might have some requirement for how this has to happen, say holding a referendum in the whole state where all citizens get to vote on whether to split, or it might not, in which case the state legislature can kind of just pass a law that says we're carving this bit of our territory up and pushing it into a new state. That's step one. Step two is then getting the federal government to admit the state into the union. This is actually a pretty straightforward process. States are admitted by passing a federal law, a normal federal law that says this is a state now, meaning all you need is a simple majority in both the House and the Senate, and then the president to sign the bill. Funnily enough, this actually means that the president can veto the admission of a state if he wants to, which has actually happened in the past. So that's a lot of words to basically say to admit a state, first pass a law at the state level, and then pass a law at the federal level. But as we all know, there's the procedure and then there's the politics. What are the political conditions necessary to split up a current state and then admit that new breakaway into America? Answer, very specific, very narrow circumstances. Let's actually start with the federal level because that political calculus is a little easier to explain. A new state in the union brings two things that are very important politically. 2 new senators and some amount of electoral college votes. So let's say you're a Democratic president. A place comes to you in Congress and says, hello, please admit me as a new state in America. You take a little look-see at the latest voting data and turns out most voters in this proposed state are Republicans. Ooh, stinky. Are you going to admit this state? Of course not. You, as a Democratic president, don't want to deal with 2 more Republican senators in what's likely a very closely divided Congress or more Republican electoral college votes. So you no fucking shot. Get lost. Then suppose a slice of territory with mostly liberal voters comes and says, please admit me, Mr. President. Then you're like, sure thing, come on in. I'd love to have 2 new Democratic senators that are aligned with me politically. The upshot, if you're only admitting one state, then the state needs to be in the same party as the sitting president, unless there's a supermajority in Congress big enough to override his veto, which basically never happens. Speaking of Congress, same thing applies there. A Democrat-controlled Congress is never going to let in a new Republican state. A Republican-controlled Congress is never going to let in a new Democrat state, all else being equal. In fact, given the way that the Senate filibuster works, you actually need a Senate that's controlled 3/5 by the party that matches the potential new states. Now, if you're hearing this and saying, gee, all we need to do is have a president, a Senate supermajority, and a House of Reps aligned with my preferred political party, that sounds hard as fuck. Well, I agree. Which is why in the modern era, it is incredibly unlikely that we would ever see a single new state admitted on its own. Instead, it's far more likely that we would see 2 states admitted at the same time, one that's left-aligned and one that's right-aligned. That way, the senators and electoral votes kind of balance each other out, meaning that no party really gains an advantage and the political gamesmanship gets zeroed out, at least a little bit. Stuff like this has happened in the past. For example, when Maine broke away from Massachusetts and was admitted into the Union at the same time as Missouri in the Missouri Compromise. The states will also probably need to be about the same size population-wise to make sure that the changes to the Electoral College and House of Reps are about the same. So that's the federal stuff. What about the state-level considerations? Interestingly, they almost kind of flow in the opposite direction. Whereas the federal level is all about big national parties aligning with each other, state-level separation stuff can create some pretty big divisions across otherwise normally politically aligned groups, and some strange political bedfellows across party lines. Let's start with the liberal state. Say there is a piece of the liberal state that comes to the state government and says, hey, actually, we would like to leave the state and make our own state, please. Now, maybe the federal level party gets involved and changes things a bit. But looking solely at the state level, how do you think a liberal state is going to respond to a liberal part of itself trying to break away? Well, a liberal state government would hate that. That's lost votes and lost members of the state legislature. A bunch of liberals leaving increases the power of conservatives in the state. Meanwhile, those state conservatives would love if a liberal part of the state left and stopped diluting their vote pool. So you might see a strange situation where the group seeking a potential breakaway teams up with a conservative minority in the state in order to get around the normally dominant Democrats. And of course, the dynamic would reverse if it was conservatives trying to get out of a conservative state. Those conservatives would team up with the liberal minority in order to form a political coalition that could pass the law that would allow the state separation to proceed. What's the upshot of this? Well, it turns out if you're trying to leave a state, you need to be the opposite political party as the party that is in control of the state government. The governor and the state legislature need to be able to say, please leave and don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. And their control needs to be so strong that they can prevent those in the same party as the separating state from blocking the separation. In summary, for a state to separate, the following needs to be true. First, the part of the state that's leaving needs to be aligned with the opposite political party as the party in control of the state government. Second, there needs to be another state trying to do separation or another American territory that wants to be admitted as a state at the same time, and this other place needs to be of the opposite political leaning as you. Third, you and this other potentially admitted state, let's call it both of you a Missouri pair, after the Maine and Missouri political opposites pair that allowed both to be admitted, need to be about the same size and population to ensure that neither liberals nor conservatives gain much of a national advantage by having you be a state. Lastly, though not a strict requirement, it might help to have a president who likes having his name attached to, oh, I don't know, big deals, big negotiations, momentous occasions in history, sound like anyone we know, and who is willing to sign a law that would admit both halves of your Missouri pair at the same time. There is some room around the edges of this. For example, a state could technically subdivide itself into two states as far as state law is concerned, but then not have the separated state be admitted by Congress, resulting in this weird situation where state law treats the two places as different, but federal law treats them as the same. That's never happened in our nation's history, and it's not clear how that would work. But those four factors I just mentioned are more or less how you get to state separation. All right, now that we have a better idea of the political conditions we need in order for a state to separate, I can make my pitch for why I think these political conditions are either already present or are going to intensify in the coming years. Here's my thesis. 3 interrelated factors are going to coincide to make a perfect storm for state separation. First, the deepening urban-rural political divide. Second, the return of gerrymandering. Third, the long-standing liberal goal to get D.C. or Puerto Rico or both admitted as a state. Start with the urban-rural divide. This isn't news, but to make a long story very short, America is at a point in its history where more people live in urban areas than rural areas. This was not the case for most of the country's history, but it is the case now. In fact, depending on what data you look like, I'm leaving that in too. Depending on what data you look at, it's something like 80% of Americans live in urban areas versus 20% in rural. Now, despite this, the average square mile of America is rural. Most areas in America are rural, not urban. The population density of these urban areas is just so big that they outnumber all the rural conservatives, even though most square miles of America are conservative, okay? Get the kind of uneven dynamic that's going on here? This wouldn't necessarily cause any issues if not for another trend. People in rural areas and people in urban areas tend to have very different politics from one another. Rural areas are almost always conservative, and urban areas, especially dense urban areas, are almost always liberal. As a result, pretty much every state in the entire country has one of these two political dynamics. It's either A, a blue state where the more numerous liberals in the cities totally dominate state politics, leaving rural conservatives out in the lurch, or B, it's a red state, where pretty much everywhere is rural except for like maybe 1 or 2 blue states, maybe the state capital, that the Republican state government bullies the fuck out of, creating, again, resentment on the part of one side for the other. Now, what might somebody in a chunk of distant rural land, tired of liberals ruling him from afar, start thinking about doing? And what might a liberal in a city in a red state start to consider when the state government starts interfering with what should be the city's own internal business? Starts letting these rural conservatives dictate how things are handled in, your own urban backyard? Well, they might think about breaking away and forming their own state so that they can control their own affairs without outside interference. They don't want to be there anymore. With few exceptions, the other side also doesn't want them to be there anymore. Sounds like a good case for mutual separation due to unreconcilable differences. And as if this urban-rural divide wasn't already causing enough tension, guess what's going on around the country right now in blue and red states alike that is really pissing off political outgroups? That's right. Our old friend and shit-ass political practice, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing election maps in as fucked up a manner as possible to maximize a political party's ability to win elections. The term gerrymander comes from an incident in which a Massachusetts state senator, Elbridge Gerry, redrew election districts in such a way that one of them vaguely represented a mutant salamander. Thus, Jerry Salamander or the gerrymander. Gerrymandering is super fucked up. It's incredibly undemocratic, probably the most undemocratic practice in America, which is really saying something. It also happens to be very much in vogue right now, on both sides of the political aisle. Republicans worried about losing the 2026 midterms are scrambling to use their allies in the state legislatures to gerrymander and squeeze out a few more Republican congressmen. Democrats never want to let a good crisis go to waste, especially a crisis they themselves caused by putting forward historically awful candidates, are explaining that actually it's super cool and based for them to be doing voter suppression right now because there's a frickin' Cheeto in the White House, don't you know? And Republicans are doing it, so, our hands are tied. We have to solidify our political control in states across the nation. Guess what the results of gerrymandering are? That's right, polarization and discontent, especially when you use the packing method that just jams everybody within a state that shares a political leaning into one shared district. If you're in a super gerrymandered state, you are very likely to be frustrated with your state government and feel that the only way to get out from under its thumb is to do something drastic like make your own state. Polarization and discontent defined by clearly discernible political boundaries, is always a recipe for upheaval, as anyone who listened to our episode on Divided We Fall might remember. You feel a certain kinship with other members of your political outgroup, especially if those members are sharing a district with you due to gerrymandering. Most important of all, the very fact that your state has gerrymandered you shows that they don't value your vote and would prefer to get rid of your political influence in the state to the maximum extent possible. That sounds like a recipe for inciting state separation to me. That leaves the third influence waiting in the wings to get state separation going: the looming presence of DC and Puerto Rico. Liberals have been wanting to get these guys their statehood for ages, especially DC. The people of Puerto Rico have a more complicated view towards statehood than DC residents that I'm not going to try and represent accurately or speak on their behalf for fear of misrepresenting their pretty nuanced positions. Now, because there hasn't been a Senate supermajority for Dems since like 2009, and those fucks didn't make it happen when they had the chance, DC and Puerto Rico haven't had a real chance at statehood in ages. Biden didn't have the numbers, and conservative presidents or Congresses weren't going to let in states they saw as Dem-leaning. But as we just discussed, states don't have to come in alone. They can come in pairs. And the presence of DC and Puerto Rico means that we have liberal halves of a Missouri pair just waiting for a conservative state to come along and seek admission. And there's good reason to think that the push for a separated state will involve the creation of a new conservative state instead of a new liberal one. In other words, will be a conservative breakaway from a liberal state. Not only are rural conservative areas often the places in America that advocate most strongly for state separation or where movements are already active, rural areas in liberal states are, to paint with a very broad brush, often not strong enough economic engines for the liberal states to fight all that hard to keep them, absent their implications for federal politics. The outnumbered conservative minority in a liberal state gets to avoid rule from afar by blue urban centers. Those blue urban centers get to send the rural conservatives who hate them packing and make their states even more blue. And either DC or Puerto Rico's people finally get to enter the Union proper, be full and equal members of America. If the population numbers line up, not too hard to manage because rural conservative areas tend to have modest population sizes that won't exceed DC's population of 700,000 and definitely won't exceed Puerto Rico's population range, then it really is just kind of a win-win-win for all involved, potentially. And I expect to see Americans perform that political calculus and realize that this is an option for them in the not-too-distant future. State separations are one of those funny political phenomena that can generate bipartisan support on the basis of mutual hatred. We all dislike each other so much that we can strongly agree with each other on one thing. Working together to put ourselves in new political units where we don't have to interact with each other seems like a good idea. In fact, I'll do one better on this prediction, actually call my shot on the state that is going to separate. I think Virginia will be the one if this new gerrymandering map goes through. The Dems are pushing this insane redistricting where Virginia would have to go from having 7 likely Dem districts to 10, leaving just one Republican-controlled district in the entire state. And that Republican-controlled district would be comprised entirely of geographically contiguous western counties. There had already been rumblings about splitting the state in light of the grip that the wealthy urban blue and populous urban counties in Northern Virginia that border D.C. had on state politics. If this map goes through, you are 100% going to see people in the west part of Virginia trying to get out of a state that just rat-fucked them into having one red district out of 11 total Virginia districts, despite something like 40 to 45% of Virginia residents being Republicans. And would you look at that? Just across the Potomac, there's a place waiting to be let in as a new state, a liberal place that would serve as a perfect Missouri pair for some subset of these conservative Virginia counties. It just kind of feels natural to see this dance play out across a shared region. It also helps that Virginia has been split before, even though the process by which West Virginia was created was highly constitutionally suspect and very different from what we've been discussing. No time to explain that now. So yeah, there's hot take number 2. By 2030, we'll be a nation of 52 states, with D.C. admitted alongside a new state made up of conservative counties to the west of Virginia. What would that state be called? Would it be like West Virginia 2? South Virginia? If you're so inclined, drop in the comments what you think the best name for a new separated Western Virginia state would be. And last but not least, we have my final hot take. Cue the drum roll. It's time to do a little agenda posting. That's right. To nobody's shock, the final take on this podcast, called localism, is that localism is going to become a rising political force in the 2 coming decades. Sorry, folks. I had to find a way to sneak in my little agenda, my little ideology somewhere. In case it's not clear, this third political hot take, is the one that I both think will happen and the one that I definitely unequivocally do want to happen. So what is localism? Well, we've done several past episodes on it, which I encourage you to go back and listen to, but basically, localism is the idea that we should give our local governments, our city councils, our county board of commissioners, our aldermen, more power, rather than invest more political authority in state governments and the federal government. There are two forms localism could take. One, which is called absolute localism, involves simply turning the pyramid of preemption upside down, making local laws preempt inconsistent state and federal laws, with the super important exception that the Bill of Rights in the Constitution continues to be the highest law in the land and can't be preempted by any level of government. The second, which I call reformist localism, doesn't change anything about the relationship between local governments and the federal government, but instead gives local governments more authority to pass their own laws free from the interference of state governments. This is achieved by carving out the area of matters of local concern, with that term being defined very broadly, and giving local governments the authority to legislate in that space without being preempted by state law. No matter which form of localism you might be interested in, an important additional element of localism is the implementation of what I'm calling proxy-based directly democratic voting, a system where laws are passed on the basis of directly democratic votes, but if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can delegate your vote to a trusted person to use on your behalf if, for example, you're too busy to be in local government meetings all the time. So, there could be a city council meeting in 2 weeks, voting on an issue you care about, maybe funding for schools, and you aren't able to make it to that city council meeting because you're busy. Maybe you have to go visit your mom, maybe you just have stuff you need to do. So instead of just your vote not counting just because you aren't able to physically show up to the city council meeting, instead you can delegate your vote to a proxy, a trusted person. So for example, maybe you give your sister your vote. You name your sister your proxy, and then she's able to go to the local government meeting and vote on your behalf. As a result, when she casts her vote on whether to pass a law, her vote would count as 2 votes. Once for her own individual vote and once for your vote that you delegated to her. You can delegate your vote to anyone at any time, and you can revoke that delegation at any time, within reason. It would probably make sense to say your proxy decisions take a week or so to go into effect to give your local government systems time to keep track of record keeping. This proxy system captures direct democracy's benefits of community enfranchisement and getting rid of party politics and the stupid gamesmanship of, small r republicanism and sort of the normal, candidates only give a shit about you every 4 years when they're trying to get their job back, in favor of a system that allows everybody to have their vote literally count, demonstrably count. This means that it isn't just 65-year-old retiree homeowners with a pension who are going to have their votes count in a democratic system, which instead everybody gets a real chance to participate, even if you're working a job or living a lifestyle that keeps you from sitting in city council meetings all the time. The mom of 3 with 2 jobs and a sick father should have her vote count too under a directly democratic system after all, and she can make it count by delegating it to a proxy. So why would we want to monkey with our system of government like this? Some of you might have had the misfortune of dealing with your local government or local political parties and maybe thinking to yourself right now, give those people more power? Sounds horrible. But here's my pitch. All these things that you might be thinking about local government, the corruption, the party politics, the gamesmanship, all that stuff is equally, if not more true about your state legislature and the federal Congress. And here's the key difference. You and me, we basically have, in reality, no say over what people do in the federal government. Our power is moot. They don't have to answer to us, and they know it. Some of us, me included, are separated from D.C. by hundreds or thousands of miles. Federal elections are won by the people with the deepest pocketbooks and who can make the best case to the big party power brokers that they'll further the interests of the elite. And to an extent, the same is definitely true in state governments. If you live in a conservative part of upstate New York, sorry, most state politicians just don't have to give a shit about you. It's a numbers game, and you don't have the numbers. But your local politicians have no choice but to care. You are their sole constituents, you are their neighbors, you are their fellow community members. If they fuck up, you and your neighbors can go to city council meetings and yell at them. Plus, when elections come around, you can decide not to vote for them, and you are the only voter base. It's your decisions that are not going to matter on this, not, some bigger group of people who live 300 miles away, but because they happen to be bigger than you, their interests are always going to win out over yours. And, this is partially just due to like ideological flavor or bent. And, oh, local governments are the closest and most responsive to the people they serve than any other form of government. But it's more than just government structure and ideological flavor. You have more power over your local government as a matter of cold, hard stats. You know what the average turnout is in mayoral elections, which is the kind of local election that usually gets the highest level of voter participation? 20%. 20%. I mean, that is fucking crazy. Your local government is making some of the most important day-to-day decisions that have the most immediate effect on your life. But while this low number is kind of disturbing, it also represents an opportunity. Low turnout plus smaller total voting pool equals more of an ability for a small group of motivated people to make an actual difference, knocking doors and handing out flyers. Want to get a different state senator or a different federal politician or pass some law on the federal level? You can hand out flyers and knock doors until you turn blue in the face, and it still probably won't change anything. Want to get a different person elected mayor or county commissioner or school board member or alderman? Well, unless you happen to live in 5 to 10 of the biggest urban areas in America, you actually can make things happen. You, with your own hands, exercising your own actions, working in coordination with your neighbors, your friends, your family, can exercise real political agency. That is not an opportunity that you have in very many other areas of your life. Local government is truly one of the few places left in America where ordinary people like you and me can have our voices heard. So while local government is not some magical place that's immune to all the bad effects of politics, it is a space where it is vastly more within your power to mitigate those bad effects than it is in a state level or federal setting. Plus, not to mention, localism is not this, ideological hardline position or party. And, it bears mentioning, localism is not this hard line, you have to follow everything in the party platform kind of movement. For example, you don't have to be dedicated to the direct democracy half of it. You could look at this crazy scheme to start having local governments be governed on a directly democratic basis with this funky proxy system and think that, I'm down for the whole let's give local government more power thing. But the whole direct democracy thing, that's not my speed. And that's totally fine. I would encourage you to still call yourself a localist if you agree with those positions but don't agree with the direct democracy stuff. But if you do agree with the direct democracy stuff, well, then you do create a very different political dynamic at the local level, one that is going to be a little more resilient against some of the party politics and political maneuvering that's endemic to small r republicanism and our state and federal level systems of government. Put simply, if you go localism's suggested route and convert into some form of government that draws from direct democracy, electoral politics and political parties become much less capable of warping things in your community in ways that are contrary to the public will, especially compared to how those forces might be warping things right now. Why is it that people in this political movement might be drawn to localism? Well, because politics in America is so miserably divided right now. Rural versus urban, liberal versus conservative, coastal elite versus flyover, pro, north versus south, the list goes on. We disagree about pretty much everything. Gun rights, taxes, foreign policies, vaccines, abortions, healthcare, gay and trans rights, immigration, organized labor, the economy, shit. You name it, we're screaming at each other on Twitter about it. And it isn't friendly agree to disagree stuff either. Oh no. This is relationship ruining, regional rivalry, traitor accusations, fist fighting, riots kind of division. And part of what's driving this division is that the federal government creates a winner-take-all system. Ordinarily, sure, a Texas conservative and a New York City liberal wouldn't see eye to eye about a lot of stuff. Certainly that Texas conservative won't be seeing eye to eye with an Austin liberal about a lot of stuff. But just disagreement wouldn't ordinarily pass the threshold into hatred. However, when preemption is top-down and whoever wins state or federal government power makes the rules for everybody, then suddenly people who think differently than you are actually, in a real sense, a threat to your life and your values, even if they live hundreds or thousands of miles away from you. You have to win this zero-sum game of top-down politics where the winners get to dominate just to change things in their own backyards. and the losers have to fight tooth and nail to avoid being subject to laws they didn't want and never consented to. In this kind of environment, there is only one thing that we can agree on, which is that we can't agree on anything. And this small point of agreement, kind of like with state separation, is enough to start forming a coalition. Enough to form the basis of a foundation for a different system. Let's get rid of the top-down winner-takes-all style of government. Let every town and county have the first say on what rules apply within their own jurisdictions. Because if a rural conservative can run his community free from outside interference, and the liberal city dweller can pass municipal policy without having to go through opposition to the state capital, why do you even need to think about what's going on elsewhere? If the Texas conservatives' actions have no political bearing on the New Yorker's life and vice versa, what does anybody gain from sustaining this energetic loathing and conflict? Nothing. There becomes no reason and no need for the kind of clashes that dominate American politics today. We all despise each other, but we are at least united in that mutual hatred, and that unity can drive us forward into a localist system where we frankly just don't have to think about or deal with each other as much. Doesn't that sound nice, just being able to live and decide for yourself what laws apply in your community without having to worry about how somebody thousands of miles away might think about it, or how it's going to play in this incredibly complicated national politics calculus? That's what localism promises. The ability to truly manage our own affairs, to have real power for change at home, for the very, very inexpensive price of losing our power to dominate and control places that aren't our home and resented us for trying to change how things worked there. To me, it's a no-brainer, and I think it's going to become a no-brainer for many others too. When might localist rumblings start? Well, maybe today. Maybe you, my fine listener, can go to a friend or a family member and talk to them about why we should challenge our assumptions about the feds being at the top and our local governments being at the bottom. Maybe you can share our content or write your local government or create your own article or video about why localism could give us more local political agency while reducing national tensions. But these shameless plugs aside, I think the really big catalyst will be the next presidential election. If conservatives win, you're going to see a liberal meltdown like we have never seen before. We're going to have liberals doubting whether or not America is even a country that wants them or has a place for them. And they're going to look at the current system that produced a result that they hate so deeply and think, man, we need to change this. And they're going to want to turn to their positions of strength, which are these, liberal municipal city governments that are just completely blue controlled, and have them be the ones that set the political tempo at home. They might view localism as the path towards accomplishing that, to take the bite out of a federal government that's been completely captured and compromised by conservative interests, and empower the governments that are closest to them and that are most likely going to be blue aligned. And doing that also means that a bunch of rural conservatives and places elsewhere, in low population places where none of these liberal political people really live in the first place, get to do self-rule and get to do some awful things that maybe the liberal people wouldn't agree with. That's worth the price of admission. In contrary, if a liberal wins, it's going to be a lot of the same dynamics. Conservatives are going to be left with this sort of soul-searching identity moment. We were ascendant, we had Trump, we put our guy into power, this anti-establishment dude who said he was going to drain the swamp, and then it didn't work, and now we lost because he made, maybe stupid strategic decisions. We're going to have to figure out the ideological divisions in our own party. Can the conservative movement even survive after this? And how are we going to get around just the never-changing calculus of there are just more people who live in the cities? There are people who live there who want to control how we live, and not just control us, but control us while hating us, telling us that our way of life and our values are wrong. In that kind of situation, to really get out from under the yoke of a federal government that is now completely controlled by liberals, and state governments and overall national political dynamics that are basically just blue urban cities beating the shit out of rural conservatives and telling them that they're bad and awful and, what's that stupid fucking word Hillary used? Deplorables. The way out of that is to make sure that you have control at home and that none of these liberal influences, these, globalist, politically correct influences can reach your home core, and that you and your fellow neighbors who share your opinions and share your culture are going to be the ones who decide really important stuff like what your kids are learning in school and what the tax rate should be and what rules apply within your home community. So, this was a very fancy way of saying the next political election is going to be extremely controversial with a lot of discontent no matter how it turns out, and it's going to expose fault lines in current American politics that are going to make people rethink our overall system of government, and then start to turn towards a solution that allows for more individual and local agency to get out from under this federal system that really is more about control and domination than it is about trying to let each person decide for themselves how best they should live. So that's my hot take number 3 by, let's say, 2040. 2040? 2045. I'll give myself a little wiggle room. 2045, I expect localism to have at least some place in the national conversation. And to reiterate, yes, this is the one I actually hope happens. And that's all for today, folks. I hope you got a kick out of this only mildly Buzzfeed coded kind of content. I kind of fucked up on my original goal of saying this is going to be listenable and shorter than an hour, but, the script gets out of control. You have a little too much fun. Hopefully you can forgive me. No, seriously, pinky promise next time will be shorter. So the reason why I know next time is going to be shorter is because next episode is going to be about something really fun and blessedly for both your ears and my poor little brain, and just not as big as some of the other topics we've discussed on the podcast. It snuck by me with all the stuff I've been working on outside the podcast, but the first episode of Localism, episode 0, was uploaded alongside episodes 1 and 2 on February 4, 2025. That's right, Localism is now officially 1 year old. Since we've reached this milestone, I thought it would be a good idea to dedicate an episode to taking stock of the current state of the podcast. Look at what our numbers are like. Celebrate our accomplishments and take a look at our failures. And pull back the curtain a little bit on what it's like to run a political podcast and YouTube channel that puts the small in small time. If that sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel @LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T, pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at @localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again that's localist with a T, pod, @gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.